Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to the warm, dusty edges of Sicily's coast, where the sea air smells of salt and diesel, and the hills above Cinisi seem to guard their secrets as fiercely as the people who live among them. Narrow streets snake between sun-worn buildings, the afternoon light turning every wall to molten gold, while old men lean against doorways, watching the world pass with the patience of centuries. Somewhere beyond the visible horizon, ships move slowly, carrying goods that might be legal or not. You probably won't survive this world if you don't understand the rules before you even speak. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 1923, Cinisi was a small but watchful town, perched where the mountains leaned into the Tyrrhenian Sea. For young Gaetano Badalamenti, the streets were more than pathways. They were lines on a map of power, each corner and piazza belonging to someone. His father worked the land, coaxing stubborn crops from soil that seemed more stone than earth, and his mother kept a home where discipline and hospitality lived side by side. Every family knew the value of keeping quiet, not because they were unfriendly, but because talk could be more dangerous than any knife. From an early age, Gaetano understood that the real conversations didn't happen in the open. They took place behind half-closed shutters or in the back rooms of cafes where espresso cups clinked like punctuation marks in unspoken agreements. The older boys on the street corner didn't just waste their afternoons. They watched who came and went, who lingered too long, who left too quickly. Gaetano watched them back, noting how respect could be conveyed with nothing more than a nod. When fishermen returned from the harbor, their catches were not only weighed in kilograms of tuna or swordfish, but in the balance of favors owed and promises kept. Even as a boy, Gaetano could see that the sea was a lifeline for Cinisi, but also a back door to the rest of the world. Boats could carry anything, and many did. At school, he was quiet but sharp. Teachers noticed his knack for remembering details, and his friends saw his ability to listen without interrupting, a rare habit for a child. This quietness made him valuable even before he knew it. In a place where discretion was gold, he was already rich. The priest at the local church liked to say that the boy had ears like a confessor, though he said it with a half-smile, aware that not all confessions were meant for heaven. By the time he was in his early teens, Gaetano had begun running small errands. Sometimes it was delivering a package from the butcher to a certain address. Sometimes it was walking a note from a man in the cafe to another in a house by the edge of town. None of these tasks seemed unusual. On the surface, they were the ordinary favors of a close-knit community. But the way the packages were sealed, the way the notes were folded, the way the recipients met his eyes only briefly before looking away, these were hints that these errands carried more weight than he was meant to know. One late afternoon, after delivering a package wrapped in brown paper and string, he paused on the steps outside the house. From inside, a man's voice rose in greeting, but the sound was quickly swallowed by the slam of a door. The air smelled faintly of oranges, though it wasn't harvest season. He would remember that smell years later, when different packages carried a different kind of cargo, one far more profitable and far more dangerous. His uncle, a man with a broad smile and careful words, began to take a more direct role in his upbringing. Sunday dinners at the uncle's house were lively affairs, filled with laughter, the clink of wine glasses, and the slow pacing of conversation. Gaetano learned that silence could be a way of saying everything, and that an insult delivered softly could cut deeper than one shouted in anger. The 1930s brought hardship to Sicily. The Great Depression reached even here, tightening belts and making tempers short. But in Sinisi, as in many Sicilian towns, the old systems of support held firm. Families helped each other. Debts were recorded in memory rather than on paper, and certain men made sure that those who stayed loyal never went hungry. Gaetano noticed that when his uncle spoke, even the local mayor listened with the attentiveness usually reserved for bishops. One evening, walking home along the coast, Gaetano spotted two small boats moving in silence toward the shore. No lanterns, no calls from the men aboard. He stopped in the shadows of an olive tree and watched as crates were passed from one boat to another. The faint smell of tobacco drifted up on the breeze. It was his first glimpse of the undercurrent that ran beneath the surface of daily life, a current he would one day navigate as naturally as breathing. The war years would change everything, but for now, the boy absorbed the lessons of his hometown. Loyalty above all, speak only when necessary, and understand that every favor has its price. He didn't yet know that these principles would carry him far beyond Sicily's shores, into a world where pizza ovens and polite handshakes hid a trade worth millions. But even then, watching the waves erase the footprints on the beach, he sensed that Sinisi was not a place you ever truly left. The 1940s rolled into Sinisi on the wheels of army trucks and the boots of men speaking English with a drawl. War had turned Sicily into a stage for the Allies, and for a brief time, the town found itself under the watchful eyes of soldiers who didn't know the unspoken rules. Gaetano, now in his late teens, moved among them with the same quiet observance he'd honed since boyhood. He noticed who gave chocolate to the children, who traded cigarettes for wine, and who paid too much attention to the wrong corners of the market. In those days, the balance of power was shifting. The fascists had been swept aside, the Americans had landed, and the old local networks had to adapt quickly. The mafia, weakened but not broken, saw an opportunity. Many people still think that the Allied occupation simply revived the mafia out of convenience. But so what do you think? Was it revival, or just the same roots pushing up through newly turned soil? Gaetano's uncle thrived in this new environment. He made himself useful to the newcomers, translating, arranging supplies, smoothing over disputes, and in return, the soldiers turned a blind eye to certain activities. Gaetano sometimes acted as a messenger, carrying notes in English he couldn't yet read, but whose destinations told him everything. It was a time when information traveled faster in whispers than in the official orders from Palermo. One afternoon, while delivering a message to the small port, Gaetano lingered near a group of men unloading crates from a military truck. The markings on the wood were from a supply depot in Naples, but the contents were clearly not military issue. Bottles of American whiskey, boxes of canned meat, even radios. The soldiers laughed with the locals as the goods were whisked away to waiting carts. It was an early lesson in how quickly war blurred the lines between official and unofficial trade. The war also brought hunger, and hunger made people take risks. Gaetano learned how to move food quietly from one place to another, bypassing the eyes of ration inspectors. It wasn't about greed, it was survival, and in survival, he found respect. Families remembered the boy who could get flour when the baker's shelves were bare, or a bit of sugar for a wedding cake in a time when sweetness was scarce. By the end of the war, Sicily was a place of contrasts. American jeeps still rattled down roads where farmers guided mules. Black market deals took place in the same piazzas where church bells called people to mass. And through it all, Gaetano's reputation grew. Not as a loud or dangerous man, but as one who could be trusted. Trust, in those days, was worth more than gold. It was during this time that he first heard of the possibilities in America. A cousin who had settled in New Jersey returned for a visit, bringing stories of neighborhoods where everyone spoke Sicilian, where business was brisk, and where the police were more predictable than in Palermo. Gaetano listened, storing away the details, imagining himself in a place where the streets were wide and the winters cold. But the rules of respect were the same. His uncle, sensing his growing ambition, began to involve him in more significant work. These weren't errands anymore. They were responsibilities. Meeting with a merchant to negotiate prices, delivering sums of money not in envelopes but in sturdy leather cases, accompanying men on trips to Palermo, where the conversations were conducted in low tones over espresso. He was never told the whole picture, but by now, he didn't need to be. In Cinisi, the sea remained the most reliable escape route. Small fishing boats continued to carry more than fish, and Gaetano sometimes joined their nocturnal trips. The work was simple: keep watch, tie knots, move crates. But each trip taught him something: the importance of timing, the use of darkness, the feel of trust in the air, when everyone on board knew that a single wrong word ashore could ruin them all. The first real test of his loyalty came when a small shipment went missing. It wasn't large, but it was important, and there were whispers that someone in their own circle had taken it. His uncle asked Gaetano to speak to a man in a neighboring village, a man who owed money and might have been desperate enough to cross the wrong people. Gaetano went, not to threaten, but to listen. Over wine and bread, the man confessed. He'd sold the goods to pay for his daughter's dowry. Gaetano didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger. He simply told the man what the consequences would be and left him to make the right choice. The shipment was returned the next day. By the late 1940s, peace had settled over Sicily in the way it always did. Quietly on the surface, with currents still running strong below. Gaetano had learned that survival here was never about force alone. It was about knowing when to move and when to stand still. It was about recognizing opportunity in the middle of chaos. And though he hadn't yet left his hometown, his eyes were already looking across the sea, toward the life that waited in the distance. The 1950s came to Cinisi in a hush, as if the town itself was catching its breath after the war. Gaetano, now a young man in his late 20s, walked those same narrow streets with a different stride. He was no longer the boy carrying packages for others. He was the one sending them out, the one people came to when they needed something done quickly and quietly. The world beyond Sicily was changing fast, new governments rising, new wars beginning. But here, the old rhythm still ruled, with the sea and the land dictating the pace of life. In those years, Cinisi's airport, tiny by modern standards, became a place of interest. Air travel was growing, and with it came new ways to move people and goods. Gaetano noticed early that the flow of cargo through the airport had its blind spots. Certain shipments were barely inspected. Certain workers knew when to look away. The idea of using air routes for transport wasn't yet common, but for someone with Gaetano's mind, it was a seed worth planting. His closest allies were still family, both by blood and by choice. His uncle, older now but still sharp, began to hand over more responsibilities. That meant negotiating not just with local merchants, but with people from Palermo, Trapani, and even Naples. Gaetano handled these meetings with a calm that impressed older men. He didn't rush to fill silences. He let others talk themselves into giving away more than they intended. One of these meetings brought him into contact with a Palermo importer who specialized in American goods, cigarettes, whiskey, even cars. They met in a seaside cafe where the waves lapped so close you could feel the spray on your skin. Over coffee, the importer spoke of how easy it was to slip a few crates of something extra into legitimate shipments, so long as the paperwork was convincing and the inspectors were distracted. Gaetano listened, saying little, but filed away every detail. It was around this time that a new opportunity opened. The post-war rebuilding of Italy had created a demand for materials: cement, steel, lumber. Official suppliers often couldn't meet the timelines, and that's where men like Gaetano stepped in. He arranged for shipments to arrive by boat under the guise of fishing deliveries. The goods moved inland quickly, with the help of friends in trucking companies who asked no questions. The profit margins were generous, but more importantly, each transaction built another strand in his growing web of influence. Not all of his work was about profit. In small towns like Cinisi, reputation was a form of currency. When a young fisherman's boat was damaged in a storm, Gaetano quietly arranged for it to be repaired. When a family couldn't afford medicine for their sick child, an envelope appeared under their door. These acts of generosity were not random. They were investments. People remembered kindness, and in this world, gratitude often lasted longer than fear. By the mid-1950s, Gaetano's connections extended beyond Sicily. A cousin in America sent word of a restaurant in New Jersey that served pizza so authentic it drew crowds every night. The cousin hinted that such places could be more than just eateries. They could be meeting points, safe houses, even hubs for business that didn't appear on tax records. Gaetano's interest in America deepened. He began asking questions about shipping routes, customs procedures, and how often people could travel back and forth without attracting attention. In 1957, a trip to Palermo changed the course of his life. He was invited to a gathering in the city's outskirts, where men from various parts of Italy and even the United States were meeting. The air in the room was thick with cigarette smoke and guarded glances. Names were exchanged, but the real introductions happened in the pauses, in the way a man's eyes lingered when he shook your hand. Gaetano left that meeting with the sense that the world he'd known was only a small part of a much larger map. The first whispers of the heroin trade reached him soon after. Sicily's position, geographically and culturally, made it the perfect crossroads for moving goods from the Middle East to Europe and beyond. At first, Gaetano kept his distance. Drugs carried a different kind of risk than cigarettes or whiskey. But as he listened to men speak of profits beyond anything the black market had seen, he realized that this was a current he couldn't ignore forever. For now, he stayed with what he knew, controlling the flow of goods through Cinisi, strengthening his network in Palermo, and laying the groundwork for something bigger. The sea still brought in its quiet cargoes. The airport handled shipments that no one spoke of, and Gaetano's name carried weight in every back room from Cinisi to the capital. He was careful not to move too quickly. In his world, patience wasn't just a virtue. It was a survival skill. On quiet evenings, he still walked the same coastal paths he'd known as a boy, the scent of salt and olive trees in the air. But now, when he looked toward the horizon, he didn't just see the sea. He saw the shipping lanes, the flight paths, the invisible lines of connection that would one day stretch all the way to America. By the dawn of the 1960s, Gaetano Badalamenti's quiet rise had become a fact of life in Cinisi. He wasn't the loudest or most feared man in Sicily. He preferred it that way. Power that came without spectacle lasted longer. Those who tried to make themselves legends too quickly often met abrupt, unceremonious ends. Gaetano moved with the tide, not against it, letting opportunities wash up at his feet before deciding which ones to pick up. The Cinisi airport, still small enough to be dismissed by outsiders, had become one of his most valuable assets. Its position on Sicily's western edge made it a perfect stopover for flights heading to and from the mainland. Officially, the shipments that passed through were agricultural products, machine parts, or textiles. Unofficially, the cargo manifests often told only half the story. Gaetano didn't have to control every crate, just the ones that mattered, and he knew exactly which those were. His influence reached into the workers' break rooms, the customs office, and even the scheduling clerks who decided which planes landed when. A misplaced signature here, a delayed inspection there, and the cargo he wanted moving would slide through the system as naturally as if it were olives or wine. The beauty of his system was that nothing looked unusual. The paperwork was clean, the staff kept their jobs, and no one outside the circle of trust ever had reason to ask questions. But his real focus was widening the circle beyond Sicily. A few years earlier, he'd made the acquaintance of a certain Paolo, a wiry man from Naples who had contacts in both Marseille and New York. Marseille was already notorious for its refining labs, and Paolo spoke freely, too freely, some thought, about the kind of profits heroin could bring. Gaetano listened, weighing the risks. He had seen the damage drugs could do, both to people and to reputations, but he also understood that refusing such a lucrative trade could mean being left behind. Around the same time, the Gambino family in New York was solidifying its hold over the city's docks and wholesale markets. Through mutual friends, Gaetano was introduced to an associate who managed several Italian restaurants in Brooklyn. On the surface, the conversation was about importing fine olive oil and cheese. Beneath that surface, it was about logistics, trust, and the shared understanding that moving certain goods required the same skill, whether the cargo was barrels of wine or bricks of something far more profitable. His first trip to America came not long after. Stepping off the plane into the cold, bustling streets of New York was like stepping into another world. The neighborhoods were dense with voices that sounded like home, but the pace was relentless. In the cafes of Little Italy, the air smelled of espresso and ambition. Deals were struck over slices of pizza, envelopes passed beneath menus, and men spoke in low tones about opportunities that stretched from the Bronx to Miami. Gaetano kept his role understated. He wasn't there to impress. He was there to observe. What struck him most was how seamlessly the community had integrated illicit business into everyday life. A pizzeria was a place for families to eat, but it was also a convenient front. Cash-heavy, low on scrutiny, open late. It was exactly the kind of operation that could hide transactions without attracting attention. Back in Cinisi, his mind turned over what he had seen. The pizza connection wasn't yet a formalized idea, but the structure was there, waiting to be used. Restaurants in America could import food products from Sicily. Hidden among the legitimate goods could be something else entirely. The supply line would be invisible to most, protected by layers of ordinary business activity. At home, He began refining the plan. He spoke with trusted friends in Palermo about suppliers who could be counted on to keep silent. He strengthened ties with shipping companies, sometimes by offering better rates, sometimes by ensuring that competitors faced sudden delays. In the airport office, he made sure the right people owed him small but unbreakable debts, favors that could be called in when needed. Still, he was cautious. He avoided any moves that might look like a sudden shift. In Sinisi, predictability was safety. He continued to support local events, fund repairs to the church roof, and make sure no family went hungry. The people who lived there didn't need to know the details of his business. They just needed to know that life was better when Gaetano was in charge. And in the evenings, sitting on his terrace with the scent of the sea drifting in, he would think about New York, the cold wind off the Hudson, the chatter in the pizzerias, and the way opportunity there seemed as constant as the tide in Sicily. By the mid-1960s, Gaetano Badalamenti had positioned himself like a man standing at the crossroads of two continents. Sicily was his anchor, but America was the horizon. He had no intention of abandoning the old world, yet he understood that the real growth, both in influence and in profit, would come from bridging the two. The pizza connection was no longer just an idea whispered over espresso. It was a skeletal plan with bones strong enough to carry weight. The first step was securing a network in the United States that could mirror the reliability he'd built in Sinisi. The cousin in New Jersey became his first point of contact, not just a family tie, but a man who understood that loyalty wasn't a matter of sentiment, it was currency. Through him, Gaetano met restaurant owners willing to place discreet orders for Sicilian products. Most of these owners weren't directly involved in anything illegal. They simply trusted Gaetano's assurances that special shipments would cause no trouble. Back home, he made certain the Sinisi airport was more than ready. The cargo bays had been reorganized so certain containers could be loaded or unloaded without ever crossing the main inspection lanes. Workers who had once been paid by the shift now found themselves receiving small, regular envelopes. Quiet reminders that their discretion was worth more than overtime pay. The customs officers, for their part, had learned long ago that there was nothing wrong with letting a few crates pass without too much scrutiny, especially when those crates came from men who could help their families in lean times. One key development came when a Neapolitan contact introduced Gaetano to a Sicilian expatriate living in Queens, a man who had deep ties to both the Gambino and Bonanno families. In a small back room above a bakery, the three men laid out the blueprint. Heroin would arrive in Sicily from suppliers in Turkey and Lebanon. It would be refined in makeshift labs in the countryside, then packed among shipments of olive oil, cheese, and flour bound for Italian restaurants in the U.S. On paper, it was all legitimate. In practice, it was one of the most lucrative smuggling routes the mafia had ever conceived. Gaetano's genius was in the subtlety. He didn't flood the route with product immediately. Instead, he treated it like an irrigation system, releasing just enough to test the channels, to see where the water pooled and where it leaked. If a shipment attracted too much attention, it would be quietly rerouted or delayed until interest faded. There was no rush. He knew patience would make the operation invisible. In Sinisi, the townspeople saw nothing unusual. They still greeted him warmly in the piazza, still accepted his help with weddings, funerals, and small debts. The fishermen still found extra fuel left for them. The farmers still saw their roads repaired with funds that never came from the local government. If anyone suspected that the money came from more than olive groves and shipping fees, they kept it to themselves. His personal life remained discreet. While some men in his position flaunted their wealth with villas and luxury cars, Gaetano preferred comfort without spectacle. A well-built stone house, a steady table at his favorite cafe, clothes tailored to fit without drawing envy. This kept him approachable, a man who could be trusted to speak plainly when it mattered. Yet behind the calm exterior, the network grew. In New York, more restaurants joined the chain, each becoming another safe endpoint for shipments. Some owners were complicit, others simply uninterested in asking questions so long as their invoices matched the deliveries. In Sicily, trusted couriers ensured that the packages were sealed in ways that only those in the circle could open without leaving a trace. The money began to flow in earnest. It came back to Sicily not in obvious bags of cash, but as investments, construction projects, land purchases, small businesses that provided both profit and cover. Gaetano moved cautiously, always making sure the paper trail looked dull and unremarkable. There were still moments of tension. A customs inspector in Naples once questioned a shipment's paperwork, delaying it for a full day. Gaetano didn't shout or threaten. Instead, he arranged for the inspector's nephew to get a job with a reliable wage. The shipments moved without issue after that. Late at night, on the terrace of his home, he could hear the distant hum of planes taking off from the airport. His airport. He'd watch their lights fade into the blackness and imagine the crates in the hold, olive oil stacked above a fortune's worth of powdered white. Somewhere across the Atlantic, the lights of New York would be waiting. By the late 1960s, Gaetano Badalamenti had refined his operation into something that looked, from the outside, almost boring. And that was the point. In a world where the loudest men were often the first to fall, his business thrived on predictability. Shipments moved on schedule, accounts balanced neatly, and the restaurants in America kept their ovens hot, their dining rooms full, and their back rooms useful for much more than storing tomato sauce. The heroin pipeline now stretched like a quiet river from the poppy fields of the Middle East, through refining labs in hidden Sicilian farmhouses, across the Sinisi airport tarmac, and into the kitchens of New York and New Jersey. Each stage of the process was controlled by someone who owed Gaetano not just money, but loyalty. If there was a weak point, it was addressed quietly, sometimes with a gift, sometimes with a reminder, but never with unnecessary noise. His reputation in Sicily shifted subtly during these years. He was no longer just the capable man who could get things done. He was becoming the man whose approval determined which ventures lived or died. Construction projects waited for his nod. Political candidates sought his blessing in private meetings. Even priests occasionally stopped by his home, not for confession, but to discuss community matters over coffee. The New York connection deepened as well. The Gambino family, now firmly under the control of Carlo Gambino himself, valued Gaetano's reliability. He wasn't reckless, didn't attract headlines, and delivered exactly what he promised. The Bonanos, too, maintained their ties, using his routes to move product without attracting the wrong kind of heat. The genius of the system was that it didn't depend on any one family. Gaetano had made himself valuable to multiple players, ensuring that no single betrayal could cut him out entirely. But success always drew attention. Law enforcement in both Italy and the United States began to notice patterns. Restaurants with suspiciously high profits, cargo shipments that always passed inspection, known associates who seemed to be in two places at once. Early investigations were clumsy, the kind that tipped their hand before they had enough evidence. Gaetano adjusted accordingly, shifting routes, changing suppliers, even letting a shipment fail now and then, so the authorities could think they'd scored a small victory. One memorable adjustment came after a tip suggested U.S. Customs was planning a surprise inspection at a New York dock. Gaetano rerouted the shipment to arrive at a smaller, quieter port in Philadelphia, disguised as part of a charity food delivery for a church. The crates passed through without a single question. The restaurant owners in New York received their product late but intact, and the delay only deepened their trust in his caution. In Sinisi, his control over the airport reached an almost seamless efficiency. Cargo handlers knew which containers to move first, which to stack in the back, and which to leave conveniently unattended until a certain truck arrived. The airport's modest size worked in his favor. There were fewer people to bribe, fewer points of failure, and every face was familiar. Money from the American side poured back into Sicily through legitimate channels. Land that had been abandoned during the war years was purchased and developed into housing. Shops were opened, employing locals who didn't know, or didn't care, where the initial funding came from. A small hotel on the coast began receiving more tourists, many of whom were greeted personally by Gaetano when they arrived. Hospitality was part of his nature, but it also served as cover. A man seen shaking hands with visitors looked like a businessman, not a smuggler. Not every part of his life was calculated. There were moments of genuine warmth, dinners with old friends, evenings spent watching the sea with a glass of red wine in hand. He kept his family close, ensuring they were protected from the rougher edges of his trade. But even those moments of ease carried an awareness. In his world, security was never a given, and the peace he enjoyed could evaporate with a single betrayal. The pizza connection had yet to become a headline, but in the shadows, it was already a legend. Those in the know spoke of it with a kind of admiration, an operation so well structured that it seemed invisible. And for Gaetano, that was the highest compliment possible. The turn into the 1970s found Gaetano Badalamenti in a position few men in his world ever reached. Powerful enough to shape events across continents, yet quiet enough to remain largely untouched by the spotlight. The pizza connection was no longer a fragile concept. It was a living, breathing network, efficient in its routines and adaptable when the air grew tense. By now, the shipments were part of a rhythm that felt almost seasonal. Crates filled with olive oil tins, cheese wheels, and bags of imported flour left Sicily with clockwork precision. Hidden deep inside, wrapped so carefully that even a sharp customs officer would see nothing unusual, were packages of heroin refined to a standard that New York buyers considered flawless. The pizzerias in America played their role perfectly. Restaurants by day, discreet distribution points by night, Gaetano's reach into the American underworld continued to widen. He maintained close contact with Gambino operatives in Brooklyn, Bonanno-linked restaurateurs in Queens, and a handful of independent players in New Jersey. His relationships were built not on intimidation, but on predictability. When Gaetano promised a delivery date, it was met without fail. That reliability made him irreplaceable. In Sicily, his influence extended beyond Sinisi. Palermo politicians sought his input on infrastructure projects. Businessmen consulted him before making expansions. Even rival clans, wary of overstepping, often chose to cooperate rather than provoke him. This was not because he was the most feared, others could be more ruthless, but because his word carried the weight of someone who never spoke without reason. Still, there were moments when the quiet surface rippled. In 1971, a Palermo informant hinted that Italian law enforcement was coordinating with U.S. agencies to map out smuggling routes. The idea of international cooperation was still new, and many dismissed it as an empty threat. Gaetano did not. He began altering patterns immediately, changing the origin ports, varying the cargo types, even letting some shipments travel through France and Spain before crossing the Atlantic. These detours cost time and money, but they confused investigators who were used to straight lines. One particularly clever move involved a shipment disguised within a Catholic Charities food drive. The goods were donated to Italian-American communities in the U.S., with media-friendly photographs of priests blessing the crates before departure. Inside a small number of those crates, cushioned between sacks of pasta, lay the real cargo. The shipment arrived without a hitch, the press coverage serving as an unintentional shield. The 1970s also brought changes in the heroin market. Demand in the United States was climbing sharply, and competition for supply routes grew fierce. Some Sicilian clans wanted to expand aggressively, flooding the market to maximize profits. Gaetano resisted. He understood that oversaturation bred chaos, and chaos attracted law enforcement like blood-drew sharks. His strategy was slower, steadier, designed for longevity rather than quick bursts of wealth. In his personal life, he remained the same, calm, almost understated. His home was well kept but not ostentatious. His clothing was tailored but modest. Visitors were received in a sitting room that smelled faintly of citrus and tobacco, where the coffee was always fresh and the conversation careful. He was a man people trusted to hear things without repeating them, a quality that in his business was worth more than gold. Yet, there was one shift he could not ignore. The next generation was watching him closely. Younger men, eager for a piece of the empire, began positioning themselves within his network. Some were talented and loyal. Others were impatient, their eyes fixed on quick rewards rather than the slow-building power Gaetano valued. He began to sense that managing ambition within his own ranks would become as important as outmaneuvering the police. For now, though, the machine hummed. Planes left Sinisi's airport at dusk, their cargo holds filled with the scent of Sicilian goods. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Gaetano knew, those crates represented not just profit, but proof that a plan born in a seaside cafe years earlier had become a silent empire. By the mid-1970s, Gaetano Badalamenti was operating in a rare air where the stakes were global, but the movements felt almost domestic to him. The routes had become muscle memory. Producers in the Middle East, refiners in Sicily, shippers through Sinisi, receivers in America. Each link in the chain was secure because each man in that chain had been tested, rewarded, and bound by a loyalty that, in Gaetano's mind, outweighed contracts or threats. In Sicily, he had begun to play the part of a quiet statesman. The local government didn't call him boss in public, but they listened when he spoke. Public works seemed to move faster when he took an interest. Roads were paved sooner. Supply shortages ended more quickly. The people knew he wasn't an elected official, but in a place where the ballot box often felt like theater, results mattered more than titles. Palermo's underworld was in flux. The heroin trade was swelling in profit, and the temptation to expand at a reckless pace was everywhere. Other clans, particularly the Corleonesi faction under Luciano Leggio and later Salvatore Riina, pushed for more aggressive moves, larger shipments, tighter control over the market, even direct elimination of competitors. Gaetano had no illusions about who these men were. He respected their cunning, but he also knew that their appetite for dominance could lead to instability. When word reached him in 1975 that the Corleonesi were quietly consolidating power, placing loyal men in key positions, he recognized the threat. His style, measured, deliberate, Predictable was the opposite of theirs. Where he sought to build alliances, they preferred to subjugate. Still, an open conflict would be disastrous for business, so Gaetano took the diplomatic route. He invited key Corleonesi figures to his home, offering them fine wine, local seafood, and the kind of Sicilian hospitality that made refusing an agreement feel like an insult. For the moment, it worked. Lines of cooperation were drawn, even if the ink was invisible and the signatures unwritten. The Corleonesi respected Gaetano's control of the Cinisi route, at least enough to avoid tampering with it directly. But he understood that such truces were temporary, more like pauses in a storm than clear skies. Meanwhile, in America, the pizza connection was entering its golden phase. The volume of product moving through the network increased, but never beyond the point of suspicion. Each pizzeria acted as a miniature distribution hub, blending into its neighborhood so seamlessly that the FBI agents who occasionally stopped in for a slice left with nothing more than a receipt and a satisfied stomach. One innovation during this time was the use of rolling shipments. Instead of sending a large quantity in one delivery, smaller loads were sent through multiple restaurants over staggered weeks. This made the network harder to map and ensured that if one shipment was lost, the damage was minimal. It was an approach straight out of Gaetano's philosophy, smaller waves that never risked capsizing the boat. In Cinisi, the airport functioned like a living organism under his direction. Cargo staff rotated in ways that kept loyalty fresh and suspicion low. New hires were quietly vetted through family connections before they even set foot on the tarmac. Even the janitors, who saw which offices were locked and which crates were moved after hours, were part of the quiet web of reliability. But there was another current building beneath the surface. Law enforcement was learning. The DEA in the United States and the Carabinieri in Italy were beginning to exchange more information, sharing files, photographs, and timelines. For decades, the ocean had been a natural firewall between investigations. Now, cooperation meant that patterns could be spotted on both ends. Gaetano adapted by adding extra layers to his logistics, more stops, more intermediaries, and occasionally using completely legitimate shipments as decoys to lure investigators away from the real cargo. Despite the rising pressure, life in Cinisi carried on as if nothing had changed. Children played soccer in the dusty piazzas, old men argued over cards, and the smell of baking bread drifted through the air each morning. Gaetano remained a constant presence, attending weddings, sponsoring festivals, and ensuring that no household in need went without help. In a place where memory was long, such acts were insurance as much as kindness. He knew the horizon was shifting. The Corleonese's ambitions were growing, and law enforcement's net was tightening. But for now, the machine still ran. The planes still lifted into the night sky, and the pizza connection remained the kind of secret everyone half knew, but no one dared to say aloud. By 1977, Gaetano Badalamenti's world was balanced on two fronts: the slow boil of tension within Sicily's mafia ranks and the steady hum of profit from the transatlantic trade. His instincts told him both fronts were changing, but not at the same speed. Money still moved quietly through the pizza connection, feeding the American families and his Sicilian base alike. But in Palermo, the wind carried a sharper edge. The Corleonesi faction was no longer content with influence. They wanted domination. Salvatore Riina and Bernardo Provenzano, both younger and hungrier than Gaetano, had begun picking away at rivals in subtle ways at first, then more boldly. Men disappeared. Territories shifted hands without formal agreements. Alliances that had been stable for decades started to crack. Gaetano, ever the diplomat, continued to advocate for balance, knowing that open war would disrupt every profitable channel. In Cinisi, he kept his daily life unchanged. Mornings were spent in the piazza, exchanging greetings, sipping coffee, and reading newspapers whose headlines only told half the truth. Afternoons were for private meetings, sometimes with Palermo businessmen about construction bids, sometimes with airport contacts reviewing the week's cargo manifests. In the evenings, he often entertained guests at his home, using the warmth of hospitality to disarm and the subtleties of conversation to gather information. The American side of the operation was stronger than ever. New pizzerias had been added to the network in Chicago, Boston, and even smaller cities where law enforcement resources were thinner. Each new outlet was carefully vetted, owned or managed by someone with family roots back in Sicily. These shops didn't just serve as endpoints, they acted as buffers. If one came under suspicion, the others could absorb the load while attention shifted away. One of Gaetano's most trusted American contacts, a soft-spoken restaurateur in Queens, began experimenting with using bakery shipments in addition to the standard pizza supply crates. Flour sacks, after all, could hide almost anything if layered properly. The change was small but significant. It gave the network a new disguise, one that investigators weren't yet looking for. Still, Gaetano noticed the signs of a coming storm. Law enforcement coordination between the U.S. and Italy was no longer a rumor. Reports reached him of DEA agents visiting Sicily, meeting with Italian magistrates who were quietly building cases on major traffickers. Files with his name on them existed, though for now they were thin, more whispers than evidence. He knew the best defense was to remain what he had always been: reliable, careful, never greedy enough to invite reckless exposure. Even so, a minor incident at Cinisi's airport reminded him how quickly things could unravel. A customs officer, new to the post and not yet educated in the local ways, insisted on opening a shipment bound for New Jersey. Inside, he found nothing illegal. Gaetano had arranged for the cargo to be clean that day, but the disruption delayed other crates, one of which carried a far more valuable load. It was a close call, avoided only because the cargo handlers worked overnight to reroute the package before the next inspection. The officer was later reassigned to a desk job in Palermo, a move that happened so smoothly it might as well have been fate. Through it all, Gaetano kept the people of Cinisi close. He sponsored repairs to the fishing docks, donated to the local school, and made sure the church had new pews. He wasn't buying affection. He was reinforcing a truth. When Gaetano prospered, the town did too, and in return, the town kept its mouth shut. But Palermo's politics were tilting, and he knew the Corleonese's patience was running thin. They didn't respect the kind of measured, consensus-driven leadership Gaetano believed in. To them, hesitation was weakness, and weakness was an opportunity. It was only a matter of time before their ambition demanded more than just territory. It would demand submission. For now, the planes still left on schedule. The crates still arrived in America, and the cash still found its way home. But in the quiet moments, Gaetano could hear it. The low, distant rumble of trouble rolling toward him. By the close of the 1970s, Gaetano Badalamenti was walking a narrowing path. The pizza connection continued to function with a precision that bordered on elegance, but the political weather within Cosa Nostra was turning violent. The Corleonesi had shed the last of their subtlety. They were no longer content with influence in Palermo. They wanted the entire commission bent to their will, and they wanted it quickly. Gaetano, as a senior figure on the commission, had always seen his role as that of a stabilizer. Meetings were held to mediate disputes, not inflame them. Profit was the common language, and survival the common goal. But the Corleonesi viewed consensus as a nuisance. They wanted rapid expansion of the heroin trade, larger shipments, more control over every link of the chain. Gaetano argued for restraint, citing the dangers of flooding markets and drawing law enforcement attention. To Raina, restraint looked like resistance, looked like, in Sinisi, daily life gave no hint of the brewing storm. The airport still operated under his quiet supervision, its cargo handlers moving containers with the same practiced choreography. The town still benefited from his patronage, streets repaired before the rainy season, fishing boats supplied with new nets, holiday celebrations funded without anyone asking how. On the surface, nothing had changed. But in private conversations, trusted allies began to speak more cautiously, as if unsure how long the balance would hold. The American side of the operation, meanwhile, was approaching its peak. Dozens of pizzerias, bakeries, and small import businesses served as nodes in a distribution web stretching from New York to the Midwest. Product moved steadily, always in quantities small enough to pass unnoticed, but large enough to keep the profits flowing. One restaurateur in Boston even joked that his best customer was a man who never ate a slice. Gaetano had started to keep a closer watch on the younger men in the network. Some, influenced by the aggressive style of the Corleonesi, wanted to take bigger risks for faster returns. He reminded them, quietly but firmly, that the longevity of the trade depended on invisibility. If the newspapers started using the words pizza and heroin in the same headline, the game would be over. But law enforcement pressure was tightening. The DEA was no longer just a distant acronym. It had names and faces on both sides of the ocean. In Palermo, magistrates like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino were beginning to gather testimony from pentiti, turncoats who spoke about routes, shipments, and names they once swore to protect. For the first time, Gaetano saw the possibility that the ocean between Sicily and America might not be enough to shield him. Then came the summons that signaled a shift in his fortunes. In a meeting of the commission, with the Corleonesi bloc now holding the majority, Gaetano was quietly but firmly removed from his position as head of the Sinisi territory. Officially, it was framed as a restructuring, a routine change in leadership. Unofficially, it was a warning. His influence was being pared down. His cautious style, once seen as wisdom, was now labeled obstruction. He left the meeting without raising his voice, without showing anger. Those who knew him understood that his silence was not submission. It was calculation. In the world he'd navigated his whole life, loud reactions only told enemies where to strike next. Back in Sinisi, he went about his business as if nothing had happened. The airport still ran smoothly, the shipments still moved. But beneath the calm, he began preparing for what might come. Certain assets were moved quietly out of Sicily. Contacts in Brazil and Spain were strengthened. The pizza connection could survive without him being in the spotlight. It had always been built to run quietly, and now that quietness might be his only shield. For the moment, the planes still left the runway at dusk, their lights disappearing into the dark horizon. But Gaetano knew the ground beneath him was shifting. The Corleonesi weren't finished, and neither were the investigators. It was a race to see which would reach him first. The early 1980s came with a sense of tightening, like a rope being drawn through gloved hands, slowly but deliberately. For Gaetano Badalamenti, the change was not just in the air, but in the way people looked at him. Allies still smiled, still shook his hand in the piazza. But there was a flicker of calculation behind their eyes, the silent math of men weighing how much longer his protection would mean what it once did. The Corleonesi were no longer circling. They were moving in. Salvatore Rina's method was direct. Remove opposition completely, then fill the vacuum with loyalists who owed him everything. Old guard bosses, men who had sat across the table from Gaetano for decades, were being picked off. Sometimes through gunfire in Palermo streets, sometimes through quiet disappearances that left nothing behind but rumors. The commission itself was now more an extension of Rina's will than a council of equals. Gaetano's removal from official control of Cinisi hadn't dismantled his network, but it had made him more exposed. Without the formal title, he was more vulnerable to challenges from ambitious younger men and to scrutiny from law enforcement. He compensated by shifting even more into the role of international broker, letting others handle the visible aspects of Sicilian operations while he focused on overseas logistics. The pizza connection remained profitable, but it was no longer invisible. In the United States, federal agents had begun to notice patterns in financial records, sudden spikes in cash deposits from small restaurants, and shipments of food products that didn't quite match the invoices. In 1980, a multi-agency task force was formed, pooling resources from the DEA, FBI, and local police departments in several states. Their goal was simple: map the entire network and find the man or men at its center. One of the first real cracks appeared in Chicago, where an associate was arrested on unrelated charges and decided to cooperate. His testimony didn't name Gaetano directly, but it confirmed that heroin was being smuggled inside shipments of pizza ingredients from Sicily. Investigators now had a phrase to chase: pizza connection, and a sense that the route was far larger than they'd imagined. In Cinisi, Gaetano stayed composed. He continued his daily walks, his visits to the cafe, his quiet dinners with family. But privately, he began testing the waters abroad. Brazil, with its large Italian community and less aggressive extradition policies, became an increasingly attractive option. A contact in São Paulo promised safe accommodations, discreet banking, and connections to South American suppliers if the heroin trade needed to diversify. At the same time, he knew leaving Sicily too soon would signal weakness. So he balanced both worlds, maintaining enough of a presence at home to show he was still in the game, while arranging the escape routes that might one day mean survival. The Corleonesi pressure increased. There were whispers that Riina wanted total control of the heroin pipeline, and that Gaetano's refusal to flood the U.S. market faster had been the first strike against him. Now, with law enforcement closing in, Riina had another reason to push him aside. A high-profile arrest of a rival would serve both as a trophy and a warning to others. One night, sitting on the terrace of his Cinisi home, Gaetano listened to the distant rumble of a plane taking off. He thought about the cargo hold, about the crates marked for American addresses, about the men waiting in Brooklyn kitchens and Jersey backrooms. The system still worked, but it was no longer the invisible thing of beauty it had once been. Too many eyes were watching it now, some friendly, some not. He understood that his life was entering its most dangerous stage. The Corleonesi might try to remove him quietly, but the Americans and Italians were aiming for something else: a public takedown, a headline that would announce the fall of a patriarch and serve as a symbol in the war on organized crime. For the first time in decades, Gaetano felt the horizon closing in, and he knew the next move would have to be his. By 1982, Gaetano Badalamenti was living in a Sicily that felt less like home and more like a narrowing corridor. The Corleonesi war machine was in full motion, its campaigns against rival families bloody and swift. Palermo's streets became stages for messages written in gunfire, and the police sirens no longer startled anyone. They were as much a part of the city's soundtrack as church bells. Gaetano still moved with the same careful dignity, but his influence on the island had undeniably shrunk. In the commission meetings, when he was invited at all, he found himself outnumbered, his counsel for restraint ignored. Salvatore Riina and Bernardo Provenzano dominated the table, speaking of volume, speed, and control as if heroin were just another commodity. Gaetano's philosophy, that stability protected profit, was dismissed as outdated thinking. The pizza connection was still flowing, though the quiet elegance of its early years had begun to fray. In the United States, the DEA task force had grown sharper, mapping routes, tracing bank deposits, and, most dangerously, cultivating informants. One of the most damaging came from within the extended network, a mid-level operative in New York who, under the weight of his own legal troubles, began feeding details about the shipment schedules and distribution patterns. His information wasn't enough to collapse the system outright, but it gave investigators a skeleton to hang their case on. Gaetano responded with the same measured caution that had kept him alive for decades. Routes were shuffled more frequently. Cargo manifests became more elaborate, with false layers of legitimate goods masking the real cargo in ways that required hours to uncover. In some cases, shipments were delayed by weeks just to throw off anyone keeping a calendar. Still, the net was tightening. In late 1982, Italian authorities executed a series of raids in Palermo and surrounding towns, targeting suspected heroin labs. Several were linked, however tenuously, to people who had once been part of Gaetano's circle. No direct evidence pointed to him, but the message was clear. His name was on the list, even if it hadn't reached the top yet. It was around this time that Brazil became more than just an idea. Gaetano began spending long stretches abroad, officially on business related to construction and import-export ventures. In Sao Paulo, he found the anonymity he lacked in Sicily, a sprawling city where he could walk a street without every passerby knowing his face. He established quiet friendships with local businessmen, some of whom had their own routes for moving goods north through the Caribbean and into the U.S. If Sicily became too dangerous, Brazil would not just be a refuge, it could be a new base, but leaving entirely was still a risk. Canisi was more than a hometown. It was the heart of his credibility. If he abandoned it, the Corleonesi could declare him finished, and in their world, perception was often as decisive as reality. So he moved between continents, careful to be seen just enough to remind Sicily he was still present, still watching. The tension between him and Riina was now an open secret. They spoke politely when they had to, but each knew the other was waiting for a misstep. Riina saw Gaetano as an obstacle to total control over the heroin trade. Gaetano saw Riina as a destabilizing force whose ambition might eventually burn the whole network to ash. In the evenings in São Paulo or Sinisi, Gaetano would sit with a map, not the kind with borders and capitals, but one showing the routes, the timings, the rhythm of a business that had taken decades to perfect. He knew that every route had a lifespan. Some ended in profit, others in prison, and a few in the ground. His task now was to make sure that when this one ended, he would still be standing on the outside, watching it close from a safe distance. By 1983, the fragile balance Gaetano Badalamenti had maintained for decades was splintering under pressure from two sides. On one flank, the Corleonese's war for absolute dominance in Sicily had turned into a full-scale purge of rivals. On the other, the Pizza Connection investigation in the United States was advancing past rumor into a coordinated, methodical dismantling. In Palermo, the Corleonese's shadow fell over every conversation. Men Gaetano had known for years avoided meeting his eye in public, not out of disrespect, but out of self-preservation. To be seen too close to him was to risk becoming collateral in Riina's campaign. Killings were no longer quiet affairs. They were statements, executed in daylight to send messages. The blood in the streets wasn't random. It was strategy, meant to shock the old guard into submission or erase them entirely. Gaetano's home turf in Cinisi remained outwardly calm, but he could feel the heat creeping closer. The airport still functioned as his lifeline, but certain workers, once unquestioningly loyal, were starting to take extra precautions when speaking with him. It wasn't betrayal yet, but it was the scent of people weighing their futures. Across the Atlantic, the Americans were connecting dots with increasing precision. The DEA, working alongside FBI agents and state-level investigators, had mapped more than 24 pizzerias and bakeries suspected of being nodes in the heroin pipeline. Financial analysts pored over bank records, flagging sudden cash surges in small-town businesses. More troubling, surveillance had begun on certain trusted figures in New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. Men who had been operating quietly for years, but were now under watch 24 hours a day. In one case, agents followed a delivery truck from a warehouse in Queens to a pizzeria in rural Pennsylvania. The driver, unaware of the tale, unloaded several boxes of frozen dough, sacks of flour, and one tightly wrapped crate that disappeared into a locked back room within minutes. The agents didn't have a warrant yet, but the photos they took would later sit in a courtroom, underlining the simplicity and boldness of the operation. Gaetano, in Brazil at the time, received word through trusted channels. His response was to make the network more elastic. Some restaurants were dropped from the chain, replaced by others in less obvious locations. Shipping manifests were altered to include goods from suppliers in Spain and Portugal, so that Sicily wasn't the only point of origin. This layering wasn't just about hiding. It was about giving investigators too many paths to follow at once. Yet, for all his adjustments, he knew the heart of the danger was no longer purely logistical. It was personal. The Corleonese's patience had run out. Riina wanted complete control of the heroin route, and that meant either forcing Gaetano into exile for good or removing him entirely. Messages came, some subtle, some blunt. A contact in Palermo warned that his name had been spoken in meetings, not as a peer, but as a problem. He weighed his options with the same care he'd always used. Staying in Sicily meant direct risk from the Corleonese and indirect risk from law enforcement. Staying in Brazil meant survival, but at the cost of being seen as a man who had abandoned his seat at the table. In his world, both could be fatal in their own way. One evening in Sao Paulo, he sat with a small circle of trusted men and traced his finger along a shipping route on the map. "It's a river," he told them quietly. "When a river meets a rock, it doesn't stop. It bends." His meaning was clear. The trade would adapt, whether he was in Cinisi, Brazil, or somewhere else entirely. But bending also meant letting go of the illusion that he could steer both the river and the politics of the commission at the same time. It was the first time he allowed himself to think of the pizza connection not as his empire, but as something he might soon have to watch from a distance. And that, for a man who had built it from whispers and patience, was a thought heavier than any shipment he had ever moved. By 1984, the tide had shifted against Gaetano Badalamenti in ways he could no longer slow, only navigate. The Corleonese's campaign for absolute control in Sicily had moved from intimidation to eradication, and every week brought news of another assassination, sometimes a rival boss, sometimes a distant cousin of someone who refused to yield. The message was consistent. No one was beyond their reach. Gaetano's long-standing principle of diplomacy now seemed almost quaint against Rina's blunt force tactics. The Corleonesi weren't interested in balancing profits with peace. They wanted the entire heroin trade funneled through their own hands, and anyone who argued for moderation was simply in the way. By mid-year, Gaetano understood that returning to a seat of power in Sicily was no longer a realistic goal. It was an invitation to a short funeral. The pizza connection remained his lifeline, but it too was under pressure. The DEA investigation, now formally named and staffed with dozens of agents, had gathered enough fragments to present a clear picture. Heroin was being shipped from Sicily, hidden inside legitimate food products, and distributed through a web of pizzerias and bakeries across the United States. The investigators didn't yet have every name, but they had a map that was starting to look uncomfortably accurate. In the spring of 1984, a significant blow landed. A key distributor in New Jersey, one of the few who could link the Sicilian supply to the American retail network, was arrested on unrelated fraud charges. Facing a long sentence, he began cooperating. His statements, while cautious, confirmed the mechanics of the operation and, more dangerously, gave investigators reason to believe Gaetano's role was not peripheral, but central. From Brazil, Gaetano responded with the same deliberate moves that had defined his career. Shipments were staggered unpredictably, using smaller loads and more intermediaries. Certain pizzerias went cold, receiving only legitimate goods for months to sever investigative trails. New routes through Venezuela and the Dominican Republic were tested, giving the operation a flexibility that could outlast the inevitable seizures to come. Still, he knew the investigation was no longer a rumor to outmaneuver. It was a campaign with momentum. Friends in New York warned him that agents were beginning to connect his visits to the U.S. with spikes in certain shipping patterns. In Italy, magistrates were leaning heavily on pentiti, extracting confessions that sometimes contradicted each other, but always seemed to circle back to the heroin trade's Sicilian roots. The Corleonesi, sensing opportunity, began feeding information to investigators, not enough to expose their own operations, but enough to make Gaetano's position more precarious. It was a quiet kind of betrayal, one that didn't require a gunshot to be effective. If the Americans arrested him, Rina could claim the spoils without spilling blood. In Cinisi, the old rhythms were changing. Without Gaetano's steady hand, the airport no longer operated with the same seamless precision. There were still loyalists, but their confidence was eroding under the dual pressures of Corleonese intimidation and law enforcement scrutiny. The community still respected him, but respect alone could not stop the machinery grinding toward him. One night in São Paulo, Gaetano sat with a single glass of wine and stared at a small notebook filled with shipment dates, port codes, and initials. He had always kept such records in his head, trusting paper to betray only the careless. But now, the pages were for him alone, a way of holding on to the structure he'd built. Even as parts of it were being chipped away, the planes still flew, the crates still moved, and the money still flowed. But he could feel the weight of the clock. Somewhere between Sicily's shifting loyalties and America's patient investigators, the window for maneuvering was narrowing. For a man who had built an empire on the art of timing, the question now was whether his own timing would hold long enough to keep him free. By 1985, the storm that had been gathering for years finally broke over Gaetano Badalamenti's head. The pizza connection was no longer a term whispered in the backrooms of investigative agencies. It was splashed across U.S. law enforcement briefings, outlined in thick binders that carried his name in black ink. In Sicily, the Corleonese's stranglehold was nearly absolute, their rivals dead, exiled, or reduced to shadows. Gaetano was one of the last men of the old guard who had not been erased entirely. But that was as much because of his location as his influence. From Brazil, he watched the headlines drift in from both sides of the Atlantic. The DEA and FBI had rolled out their case in earnest. Surveillance photographs, phone transcripts, seized shipping records, all were being pieced together into a narrative that traced heroin from the poppy fields of the Middle East to refining sites in Sicily, to flour sacks and tomato sauce cans bound for American pizzerias. His own movements, once a blur across continents, were now neatly charted on investigative timelines. The arrests began in waves. In New York, federal agents raided pizzerias that had been part of his network for years. Owners and employees were let out in handcuffs, their shops left half-lit, ovens cooling with dough still inside. In New Jersey, warehouses tied to the supply chain were padlocked. In Chicago, a trusted intermediary was caught with ledgers that, while coded, revealed enough to confirm the structure of the distribution system. Gaetano's name surfaced in court documents, not yet as a defendant, but as the man prosecutors described as the architect. It was a word that flattered and threatened in equal measure. In Sao Paulo, he felt the walls inch closer. Brazil still offered a measure of protection from extradition, but treaties were shifting, and U.S. pressure on foreign governments was increasing. The Corleonese's moves were as deliberate as the investigators. They began encroaching on what remained of his influence in Sicily, taking over smuggling routes, replacing old contacts at the Sinisi airport with their own men. There were no direct threats, no open declarations, but the message was clear. If the Americans didn't end his reign, they would. Gaetano adapted the only way he knew how, by making the network even harder to kill. Smaller shipments moved along routes so varied that mapping them became a chore, even for those inside the operation. Some heroin left Sicily disguised in air freight bound for Canada, then crossed into the U.S. by truck. Other loads moved through Caribbean islands, taking advantage of local customs systems where bribes were both cheap and effective. But each adjustment felt less like growth and more like survival. The elegance of the pizza connection had been replaced by improvisation, necessary but messy. The steady hum of the old system was gone, replaced by the irregular pulse of a patient in distress. In the quiet of his Brazilian apartment, Gaetano kept to routines. Morning coffee, a short walk, an afternoon of phone calls to New York, Miami, Madrid. He no longer discussed Sicily unless necessary. Too many of his old friends were either gone or wearing wires. He spoke instead of shipments, payments, and the careful timing of movement, a language he had been fluent in for decades, yet, for all the danger pressing in, he did not allow himself panic. In his world, fear was the quickest way to make mistakes, and mistakes were invitations. He had always believed that survival was as much about composure as strategy. But he also knew that no amount of calm could change the fact that both the law and his enemies had set their sights on him. The planes still left their runways, the crates still crossed oceans, and the money still moved. But Gaetano could feel it in his bones. The clock was louder now, and it wasn't ticking in his favor. The first months of 1986 brought a kind of stillness around Gaetano Badalamenti that was anything but peaceful. It was the quiet of men holding their breath, waiting for the next move. In Brazil, he could still walk the streets without fear of an ambush, but he knew the threads pulling at his life were now tangled in courtrooms thousands of miles away. The Pizza Connection case had shifted from scattered arrests to a single, sprawling trial in New York. Federal prosecutors were calling it one of the largest narcotics cases in U.S. history. More than 36 defendants, hundreds of witnesses, evidence stacked in file boxes that reached the ceiling. The narrative was clear. Heroin refined in Sicily, shipped under the cover of food products, and distributed through pizzerias across America. Gaetano's name was there, threaded through testimonies, wiretaps, and seized shipping manifests. Back in Sicily, the Corleonesi were cementing their grip with the same ruthless efficiency that had brought them to power. Their men now controlled not only the Sinisi airport, but also the political channels and municipal contracts Gaetano once influenced. In some cases, his old allies switched sides quietly, preferring to survive under Riena's shadow rather than stand beside an absent patriarch. It was not betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was survival in the Sicilian sense, where loyalty was elastic when life was on the line. Gaetano adapted by treating Brazil as both shield and base. He deepened his ties with local businessmen who handled goods moving north, using routes that blended into the legal export industry. Coffee shipments, timber cargoes, and even refrigerated containers of fruit became part of his layered disguise. These weren't permanent replacements for the Sicilian pipeline, but they gave him breathing room. He also worked the phones with precision. Calls to New York were brief, coded, and often routed through third parties in Europe to muddy their origins. Payments moved through banks in Luxembourg and Panama before reaching their final destination. It was a chessboard with more pieces than ever before, and one false move could give both prosecutors and the Corleonesi an opening. The trial in New York was a constant hum in the background. Witnesses spoke of meetings in pizzerias where cash and product exchanged hands, of shipments from Sicily that always arrived heavier than their paperwork suggested. A few named him outright. Others used phrases like, "the man in charge," or "the one in Brazil." It was enough for prosecutors to begin framing him not just as a participant, but as the mastermind. One evening in São Paulo, as rain hammered the balcony outside his apartment, Gaetano took a long look at a world map pinned to the wall. His gaze moved from Sicily to New York, then down to Brazil, tracing the routes like old scars. The map was crowded with pins and notes, reminders of a system he had built from patience and calculation. Now, some of those lines were frayed, others cut entirely, but for all the pressure, he refused to see himself as finished. He reminded his closest men of a truth he had always believed. In their world, survival wasn't about never being cornered. It was about finding a door when everyone else saw a wall. The planes still flew. The crates still moved. The money still came. But every departure carried the question of whether it would be the last to reach its destination. By 1987, the inevitability of what was coming had settled into Gaetano Badalamenti's daily routine like a shadow that followed him no matter the light. The Pizza Connection trial in New York had rolled into its second year, a marathon of testimony, exhibits, and translation headsets. Each new witness seemed to pull the noose tighter, describing routes, payments, and meetings that prosecutors wove into a narrative with his name at the center. In São Paulo, he kept his composure. Neighbors saw a well-dressed older man who took his morning coffee at the same corner table, who nodded politely to shopkeepers and read the papers without fuss. What they didn't see were the late-night phone calls to Europe, the coded telex messages, and the financial maneuvers meant to keep the network alive without drawing direct lines back to him. The Corleonese's control in Sicily was now so complete that even his absence no longer stirred resistance. Sinisi, once his stronghold, functioned under new management. The airport staff he'd nurtured for years had been reshuffled or intimidated into new loyalties. Construction projects, festival sponsorships, and the quiet acts of patronage that had once defined his influence were now attached to other names. Names that answered to Rina. The DEA's attention was no longer split. Gaetano was now openly named as a defendant in the ongoing U.S. case, charged in absentia with conspiracy to traffic heroin. Arrest warrants were coordinated with Italian authorities, and though Brazil was still a legal buffer, the winds of extradition politics were shifting. American diplomats spoke with Brazilian officials in private, urging cooperation. In this climate, Gaetano took no unnecessary risks. Travel was limited to essential moves, and even then under assumed identities, with passports obtained through quiet channels. His meetings were smaller, tighter, no more large dinners, no public gatherings. The network he maintained was leaner now, built around only those whose loyalty had been proven under stress. The American end of the pizza connection had adapted too. With the spotlight on pizzerias, some distribution shifted to cafes, bakeries, and import warehouses that didn't fit the public image of the case. Shipments moved through Caribbean transshipment points, sometimes entering the U.S. by private plane under the guise of specialty food imports. Every adjustment was designed to buy time, though Gaetano knew the elegance of the old system had given way to a constant scramble. In private moments, he allowed himself the honesty he wouldn't show others. The game had changed beyond recognition. The quiet rules of his youth, the balance of loyalty, respect, and discretion had been replaced by a landscape where greed was faster, violence was louder, and law enforcement was far more patient than anyone had imagined. One night, in a dimly lit apartment in São Paulo, he studied the latest shipment reports and paused at a number circled in red. It wasn't the largest profit he'd ever seen, but it was steady, reliable, proof that even under siege, parts of his creation still functioned. He smiled faintly, not in triumph, but in recognition. A river might be dammed, diverted, or split, but water found its way downstream. Yet he knew rivers ended too. The planes still left. The crates still crossed borders. The money still found accounts. But each successful delivery felt more like an extension than a guarantee. The real question now wasn't whether the system would collapse. It was whether it would happen on his watch or after he had already slipped beyond reach. By 1988, the walls around Gaetano Badalamenti's world had drawn so close that even the ocean between him and his pursuers no longer felt like protection. The pizza connection trial in New York had concluded with a spectacle worthy of headlines. Guilty verdicts for most of the defendants, sentences that would stretch decades, and a prosecutorial narrative that cast Gaetano as the patriarch who had envisioned the whole machine. In the court transcripts, his name appeared with an almost rhythmic regularity, sometimes as an allegation, sometimes as a fact, depending on who was speaking. In São Paulo, he read the reports with a face that betrayed nothing. The cafe owners who saw him each morning wouldn't have guessed that half a world away, lawyers and prosecutors were debating how to bring him to an American courtroom. But he knew the trial had changed his position permanently. He was no longer just a target for rivals. He was a public prize for law enforcement. Brazil's relative safety was beginning to erode. Quiet rumors reached him that U.S. officials were pressing for a formal extradition agreement. He still had time. Months, perhaps a year. But time was no longer his ally. His trips outside São Paulo became rare and always cloaked in layers of misdirection. A drive under one name, a flight booked under another, and a final destination only revealed to his driver at the last moment. The Corleonesi, sensing his vulnerability, didn't need to act directly. Their men had absorbed most of the infrastructure he'd left in Sicily. The Sinisi airport was fully theirs now, its shipments feeding into a heroin market that no longer bore his touch. Rina didn't need to kill him. Absence had done the work. But removing him from the chessboard entirely, whether by violence or arrest, would still serve as a statement. The remnants of the pizza connection network were running lean, but still operational. Smaller shipments moved through unconventional routes. Specialty food importers in Canada, flour exporters in the Caribbean, even containers routed through West Africa before turning toward the U.S. The profits were smaller, but the risk profile was lower. Exactly the kind of strategy Gaetano favored when the ground was unstable. Yet he could feel the strain on his closest men. Years of pressure had thinned their numbers, and the ones still loyal were tired, always glancing over their shoulders. In New York, a handful of his old associates who had escaped indictment began to distance themselves, not out of disloyalty, but because association now came with a spotlight. One humid evening, as he sat on his balcony overlooking the São Paulo skyline, Gaetano thought of Cinisi. Not the Cinisi of the headlines, but the one of his youth. The narrow streets, the salt in the air, the unspoken agreements that had kept the gears turning without ever writing down the rules. It felt like a different planet now, not just a different time. He had built an empire designed to be invisible, and for years it had worked. But invisibility, he now realized, wasn't permanent. The longer you lasted, the more footprints you left, and sooner or later, someone would follow them all the way back to your door. The question was whether they would knock politely or break it down. For the moment, the plane still departed, the crate still moved, and the money still arrived. But Gaetano had stopped thinking in terms of expansion or even stability. Survival was the only metric left, and even that was starting to feel like borrowed time. By 1989, Gaetano Badalamenti's life had compressed into a set of disciplined habits, each one designed to leave as few traces as possible. In São Paulo, he was a man who kept the same table at the same cafe, tipped generously without excess, and spoke in low tones to the same small circle of visitors. Outside that bubble, he no longer existed. No public appearances, no photographs, no unnecessary phone calls. The pizza connection case had entered its afterlife in the United States. The convictions were behind them, but the prosecutors weren't finished. They wanted the architect himself, and they made no secret of it. His name was invoked in interviews, in congressional hearings on organized crime, even in law enforcement press releases. For the DEA, his arrest would be the trophy atop the case. Brazil's insulation was thinning. American pressure to modernize extradition policies was working its way through diplomatic channels, and Gaetano's lawyers quietly warned him that the terms of his safety might change faster than he expected. There were whispers of Brazilian officials who could be persuaded to cooperate, not through bribes, but through political favor to Washington. Sicily had moved on without him. The Corleonese's grip was absolute, their network now the central artery for heroin moving through the island. Men who had once owed Gaetano everything now owed Riina their lives. There was no Sinisi to return to, not the one he had ruled. The streets would still smell of salt and diesel, but the doors that had once opened to him would stay shut or be guarded by faces he didn't know. Still, fragments of his old system endured. The surviving branches of the pizza connection were stripped of their grand scale but still profitable in miniature. Canada had become a modest hub, with shipments routed through Italian immigrant bakeries in Montreal. In the U.S., a handful of low-profile outlets kept the cash trickling back, the lines deliberately blurred with legitimate business to the point where even an investigator would find the returns dull. His life in Brazil became a study in caution. He used cash for everything. Meetings were scheduled without fixed locations until the last moment. When travel was necessary, he left false trails behind. Bank withdrawals in one city, hotel reservations in another, while moving quietly in the opposite direction. Every contact was compartmentalized. No one man knew the whole picture anymore, but even as he tightened the circle, Gaetano knew the greater danger was no longer the Corleonese. It was the reach of American justice. Riina's men would not waste resources chasing him across continents when the DEA was already doing the work. If the Americans succeeded, Riina would inherit the satisfaction without firing a shot. One afternoon, as he walked back from the cafe under the shade of São Paulo's jacaranda trees, Gaetano considered the irony. He had built the pizza connection to be untouchable by law enforcement, layered, indirect, masked by legitimate commerce, and for years it had worked. But time was a solvent. It wore down secrecy, exposed the seams, and brought even the most careful structures into the light. At night, the city's skyline stretched out below his balcony, a glittering web of lights that reminded him of the routes he once commanded. Only now, the lines ran in reverse, not from him outward, but from every corner inward, converging on the quiet apartment of a man who had once believed no one could follow the trail. For now, the calls still came, the shipments still moved, and the cash still found its way into safe hands. But Gaetano no longer mistook this for control. It was endurance, pure and temporary. And endurance, he knew, always had an end date. By 1990, the illusion of distance as protection had thinned to transparency. Gaetano Badalamenti could still walk São Paulo's streets without a bodyguard trailing behind him, but it wasn't because he felt safe. It was because danger now traveled on paper and in whispered agreements between men in suits, not on the heels of gunmen. The Americans had made his arrest a diplomatic goal. What had once been scattered hints in embassy cables was now a sustained push. Requests for legal cooperation, quiet meetings with Brazilian ministers, a steady drip of pressure applied through trade discussions and law enforcement exchanges. He was no longer simply wanted in the United States. He was an item on an agenda. The network he had once commanded had become almost unrecognizable. The pizza connection, as the world had known it, was gone, dismantled piece by piece after the trial. What remained were fragments, small cells in Canada, a handful of discreet importers in the U.S., occasional loads routed through Spain or the Caribbean. They were profitable enough to keep a circle of loyalists paid, but no longer the artery that had once pumped millions across the Atlantic. Sicily was a closed chapter. News from home came rarely, and when it did, it confirmed what he already knew. The Corleonese's dominance was complete. Riena's men ran the heroin routes Gaetano had helped build, but they did so with the recklessness he had always warned against. The market was being flooded, the violence drawing constant police presence, and yet they saw this as strength. If there was satisfaction in knowing that his old rivals were courting the kind of attention that eventually destroys empires, he didn't show it. Life in São Paulo had narrowed to essentials. His apartment was modest by his standards, comfortable but without the kind of ornament that invited curiosity. Meetings were held in motion, walking along busy streets where the noise swallowed voices. When business required a fixed location, he preferred public spaces where no one could mistake a conversation for secrecy. In quieter hours, he thought about the system he had designed, about the years when every shipment was a brushstroke in a painting only he could see in full. It had been a work of precision, measured volumes, invisible movement, controlled relationships. Now, those brushstrokes had been scattered across different hands, different priorities, some fading, others smeared. Still, pieces of the old discipline remained. The smaller operations were run by men who had learned directly from him, cautious, deliberate, willing to wait for the right moment rather than chase every opportunity. Their shipments moved without fanfare, their profits modest but consistent. In these, Gaetano saw a mirror of the philosophy that had once made the pizza connection untouchable. But he knew time was running out. His lawyers spoke more openly now about extradition as a possibility, not just a distant threat. American officials in Brazil's capital were described as persistent by those who dealt with them. A conviction in absentia in Italy had already marked him legally. If Brazil agreed to hand him over, the transition from free man to prisoner could happen in a matter of weeks. One evening, standing on his balcony as the city lights blinked into view, he considered what escape still meant. There were still places in the world where the law's reach was softer, but they were fewer than before, and each carried its own risks. Moving again would mean leaving behind the remnants of his network and the comfort of a city that had learned to ignore him. Staying meant betting on politics and time, two currencies he no longer controlled. For now, the shipment still made it through, the payment still arrived, and the circle of trust still held. But every successful week felt less like proof of control and more like the calm before a door opens to men with papers and handcuffs. By 1991, Gaetano Badalamenti's life had become a careful exercise in waiting for a move he couldn't control, from an opponent he couldn't see. The streets of São Paulo still offered him anonymity, but it was the anonymity of a man whose name was better known in courtrooms than in neighborhoods. He was a ghost in public life, yet on paper, he was a headline. The U.S. government's pursuit had shifted from persistence to inevitability. Extradition was no longer an abstract possibility. It was an active process, with petitions filed and formal requests exchanged between capitals. His lawyers worked every angle, arguing technicalities, raising jurisdictional disputes, and exploiting the slower rhythm of Brazilian legal proceedings. But even they admitted the window was narrowing. The network he had once commanded was now less a structure than a memory. The pizza connection, as it had been, was gone. What survived were quiet tributaries that no longer flowed through him directly. A small operation in Canada kept moving steady product under the cover of bakery imports. In the U.S., a pair of low-profile distributors maintained enough distance to stay out of the spotlight. The money still came, but it came like rain from a cloud that was drifting further away. From Sicily, the news was predictable. The Corleonesi were still in control, still flooding the heroin market, still keeping order through the same violence that had driven him into exile. Riina's grip was so complete that even his enemies now operated with his tacit permission. Gaetano's name, once enough to command respect across the island, was now spoken quietly as a relic of an older style. In São Paulo, he kept his patterns tight. The morning cafe visit, the afternoon walk, phone calls routed through 2 or 3 intermediaries before they reached their target, cash payments made in person, never discussed over a line. He no longer bothered to expand or innovate. Every action was measured against the single goal of avoiding a mistake that could speed up the inevitable. One evening, after a discreet meeting in the back of a florist's shop, he returned home to find a letter from his legal team. The tone was clinical. The Brazilian courts had scheduled a hearing on the U.S. extradition request. It would be the first time the matter was argued in full, and the outcome would set the course for everything that followed. He read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer without speaking a word. He had survived decades in a world where survival was often measured in weeks. He had built an empire from whispers and patience, bridged continents without drawing the gaze of the law for years. But now, the law was not just looking. It was reaching. The planes still flew. Somewhere, crates still moved under false manifests. Payments still landed in accounts that only a handful of men could access. But for the first time, Gaetano began to think of those movements not as the pulse of a living network, but as echoes of something already past its peak, and in the quiet of his São Paulo apartment, he understood that the next chapter would not be written by his hand alone. In 1992, the inevitability that had loomed for years finally began to harden into reality. The Brazilian courts had moved slowly at first, sifting through filings, affidavits, and the political weight behind the U.S. extradition request. But now, hearings were coming in closer succession, and Gaetano Badalamenti's name was being spoken aloud in legal chambers with a formality that stripped it of the old respect it once commanded. On the streets of São Paulo, he remained what he had long been, a polite, composed figure who blended into the background. The cafe owner still greeted him with the same nod. The street vendors still offered him the first fruit of the day. But beneath that surface, he felt the shift. He had become a man whose freedom depended on the thin ice of procedural delays, whose next step might be dictated by a signature on a document thousands of miles away. The American pursuit was relentless. Prosecutors in New York prepared their case as if he were already in custody, refining the narrative that cast him as the mastermind of the pizza connection. They had seized on witness testimony, shipping records, and coded ledgers that, in their telling, left no doubt. For the U.S. Justice Department, this was not merely a prosecution, it was a capstone, a chance to put a face to one of the largest heroin cases in their history. Back in Sicily, the Corleonese's power had reached its high water mark, though Gaetano suspected it would not last. The same recklessness that had once disgusted him was now drawing unprecedented scrutiny from Italian law enforcement. Riina's name was on every magistrate's desk, and large-scale operations were seizing product before it could leave the island. Gaetano watched this from afar with a kind of detached irony. The empire Riina had chased so violently was starting to choke on its own excess. His own network had shrunk to what could be managed with absolute discretion. A pair of Caribbean ports provided cover for small shipments, routed through legitimate exporters and mixed into containers of bulk goods. Payments traveled through a chain of accounts so slow and indirect that by the time they reached their destination, the original transaction was weeks old. These were not the grand flows of his heyday, but they were enough to keep a few loyal men working and a small reserve building quietly. The legal strategy in Brazil became a game of attrition. His lawyers filed appeals, challenged evidence on technical grounds, and questioned whether the alleged crimes even fell within extraditable offenses under Brazilian law at the time they occurred. Each motion bought weeks, sometimes months, but he knew the Americans could afford patience more than he could. In the evenings, he would sit on his balcony and let the noise of São Paulo's traffic rise up like a tide. The city was vast enough to hide him in plain sight, yet his thoughts were rarely here. They drifted to Sinisi, not the Sinisi of the Corleonese's grip, but the one of his youth. Fishing boats at dawn, the smell of bread baking, the murmured greetings that carried meaning beyond the words. He had built a system meant to last beyond him, and in some ways it had. Even stripped of scale, fragments of his design still moved in silence, feeding families and keeping certain doors open. But the power was no longer his to command fully. He was the architect of a structure now maintained by others, some loyal, some simply pragmatic. The planes still flew. Somewhere in the world, a crate carried both the taste of Sicily and the shadow of his old empire. But he knew that soon, his horizon might be reduced to the walls of a courtroom, or worse, a cell in a country that had waited years to put him there. By 1993, the inevitability of Gaetano Badalamenti's fate had settled into the rhythm of his days like a second heartbeat. Steady, constant, and impossible to ignore. The Brazilian courts were moving with unusual speed now, as if someone behind closed doors had decided the time for deliberation was over. Hearings came one after another, each narrowing the gap between him and a one-way ticket to New York. In São Paulo, he maintained his habits with almost stubborn precision. The same morning walk to the cafe, the same cautious meetings, scheduled at the last moment, often shifting locations twice before settling on a neutral ground. To an outsider, he looked like a man living a quiet retirement. To those who knew him, it was clear he was a man trying to keep his world from shrinking to a set of prison walls. The Americans had their case polished to a sheen. Prosecutors spoke in press interviews of bringing the final architect to justice. They recited the arc of the pizza connection with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of preparation. Heroin refined in Sicily, hidden among food products, shipped to pizzerias in the U.S., distributed through a network that touched every major northeastern city. His name wasn't just in the files, it was the headline. Meanwhile, in Sicily, the Corleonese's iron grip had begun to show cracks. The arrest of Salvatore Riina in January sent shockwaves through Cosa Nostra. Allies scrambled to protect their positions. Rivals tested the edges of the vacuum his capture created. Gaetano read the news in a Brazilian paper and lingered over it longer than usual. He knew better than to think the Corleonese's empire would collapse overnight, but he also knew that every boss eventually reached the moment when the hunters became the hunted. His own surviving network was now a skeleton operation. A small flow through Caribbean ports kept just enough profit moving to sustain a few loyal men and cover the costs of legal defense. Shipments were tiny compared to the past, routed through legitimate exports of coffee and sugar. The cargo masked so well, it would take days of inspections to uncover the truth. These weren't moves to expand. They were moves to preserve. The legal fight in Brazil had become more tactical than hopeful. His attorneys argued over procedural flaws, challenged the validity of foreign evidence, and pressed for every possible delay. But privately, they told him what he already knew. The political climate had shifted, and Brazil was leaning toward cooperation with the United States. Each appeal was not a wall. It was a stepping stone across a river whose current was getting faster. At night, on his balcony, he looked out over the sprawl of São Paulo and thought less about escape and more about control. Control over what was left of his life. Control over how and when the endgame would play out. In his world, being taken was one thing. Being taken unprepared was another. The planes still flew. Somewhere, shipments still moved under the cover of commerce, echoes of the empire he had built in silence. But for the first time, Gaetano began to measure his future, not in years, not even in months, but in the number of court dates left before the door closed completely. By 1994, the timeline that had once felt elastic was snapping into place. The Brazilian courts had denied his latest appeal, a ruling delivered with the kind of procedural bluntness that left no room for misinterpretation. Gaetano Badalamenti now stood only a few legal steps away from the end he had anticipated for years. Extradition to the United States. He moved through São Paulo as if nothing had changed, though in truth, everything had. The morning cafe ritual remained, but the pauses between sips grew longer. Meetings still happened, but more often they were about tying off loose ends than about initiating anything new. His voice on the phone, when he used it at all, was measured, almost resigned. The Americans had sharpened their message. To law enforcement, Gaetano was the missing keystone in the pizza connection case, the one figure whose absence in the courtroom had left the story unfinished. Now, after years of diplomatic persistence, they were preparing to close the book. In New York, prosecutors rehearsed the presentation of their evidence, a narrative polished by a decade of pursuit. The shipments, the coded ledgers, the pizzerias as facades, and the man in Brazil who had orchestrated it all. Sicily had changed beyond recognition. The Corleonese's dominance had been dented by Riina's arrest the previous year, but their structure remained intact, run now by men who had learned his methods. Gaetano read the Italian news and saw the familiar cycle: arrests, assassinations, and the quiet repositioning of power. He no longer entertained thoughts of returning. Even without Riina, Sinisi was not the town he had left behind. His surviving operations were now whispers of their former selves. A few shipments moved each year, routed through layers of legitimate trade so intricate they barely resembled smuggling at all. Profits were modest, but steady enough to cover his legal expenses and maintain a life that, while constrained, was still on his terms. The final legal maneuvers in Brazil were set in motion. His lawyers prepared a last appeal to the Supreme Federal Court, not out of optimism, but as a delaying tactic. They advised him to prepare for transfer at any moment. Gaetano, who had spent decades anticipating every possible contingency, did not need the warning. He had already reduced his personal possessions to what could be carried in a single suitcase: clothes, a few personal documents, and a small leather notebook filled with numbers and names that only he understood. One night, as the rain fell against the glass doors of his balcony, he stood looking out at the lights of the city. The skyline stretched to the horizon, each glowing window a reminder that the world outside was still moving at its usual pace. He thought about the first shipment he had sent across the Atlantic, how unremarkable it had seemed at the time, and how it had grown into something that touched cities he had never even visited. The planes still flew, though fewer of them carried his shadow. Somewhere, in a restaurant far from here, a crate might still be opened to reveal something other than cheese and olive oil. But he knew these were no longer steps in an ongoing game. They were echoes, fading each day. The countdown had begun, and for the first time, Gaetano no longer wondered if he would be taken. Only when, in 1995, the waiting ended. The final ruling from Brazil's Supreme Federal Court arrived without ceremony, just paper and signatures carried into his lawyer's office. The language was formal, almost cold. Brazil would honor the extradition request of the United States. There would be no more appeals, no more procedural pauses. The long corridor he had walked for years had reached its final door. The news did not change his routine. That morning, Gaetano still walked to the cafe, still ordered the same coffee, still exchanged polite greetings with the owner. But when he returned to his apartment, he began the quiet dismantling of the life he had kept here. The few possessions that mattered were already packed. A small suitcase, the leather notebook, a handful of photographs. Everything else he left behind without a second glance. The Americans had prepared for this moment. Agents coordinated with Brazilian police to make the arrest as uneventful as possible. No spectacle in the street, no sudden violence. When they came for him, Gaetano greeted them with the same calm he had carried for decades, nodding once before allowing the cuffs to close around his wrists. In his world, dignity and defeat was as important as cunning and power. The flight north was long, the hum of the engines constant. He sat quietly, looking out at the clouds, his thoughts unbroken by conversation. Somewhere below were the routes he had once commanded, ports, airports, cities that had been connected by invisible lines of trust, timing, and silence. They were still there, but no longer his. In New York, the courthouse was ready. The trial that would follow was a distillation of years of investigation, testimony, and the legend that had grown around his name. Prosecutors laid out the story in full. The Sinisi routes, the airport as a hub, the shipments disguised as pizza supplies, the reach into American neighborhoods. Witnesses spoke. Documents were displayed. The case was no longer about proving the network existed. It was about placing him at its head. The verdict was inevitable. Gaetano Badalamenti was convicted and sentenced to decades in prison. The man who had once been called the Patriarch of the Pizza Connection now spent his days in a cell, the outside world reduced to the sound of doors locking and the measured steps of guards in the hall. In the quiet of confinement, he carried the same discipline he always had. He spoke little, observed much, and never allowed others to see weakness. On certain days, when the light came through the bars at a particular angle, he would think of Sinisi, not the Sinisi of the Corleonesi or the police, but the one of his youth. The smell of the sea, the rhythm of the streets, the coded glances that held more meaning than words. The planes still flew somewhere. The crates still moved under other hands. The empire he had built had changed faces, changed methods, but the shape of it still lingered in the shadows. He had been removed from the game, but the game itself endured. And so, in the long hours between morning and night, he kept that thought close. Not as pride, not as regret, but as a reminder that even when the architect is gone, the structure sometimes stands. And now, as the story settles, let's allow the edges to soften. Picture the Sicilian coast at dusk, the sea breathing in and out against the rocks, the air scented faintly with salt and lemon. The streets of Sinisi are quiet, the doors closed, the day's heat stored in the stone. Somewhere, a light flickers in a kitchen window, the clink of dishes carrying into the night. The noise of courtrooms, airports, and engines fades here. In its place is the slow rhythm of waves and the stillness of a town that remembers more than it says. Let that stillness stretch, each breath a little slower than the last. The world beyond the shore can wait. For now, there is only the sound of water, the scent of the evening air, and the comfort of knowing that the tide will return, as it always does, without hurry and without fail.